Authority crumbles when the person who should fear you most simply refuses to acknowledge your power. Du Hyun-sung learned that lesson in his throne room in Shanghai, when the woman his family had discarded 7 years ago returned with a 5-year-old boy who stood in the center of massive marble hall, arms crossed, completely unshaken by the presence of the most feared crime boss in East Asia, refusing to bow or show any recognition of the power that made grown men tremble. The story started 8 years earlier, when Du Hyun was 34 and being groomed to take over his family's criminal empire. The Sung family controlled organized crime throughout Shanghai and surrounding regions, gambling, loan sharking, protection operations, legitimate businesses that laundered hundreds of millions annually. Du Hyun's father was the current king, but age and health issues meant succession was approaching. Du Hyun was being prepared for leadership through increasing operational responsibility and strategic decision-making. He was brilliant, ruthless when necessary, respected and feared by the organization's members and rivals alike. He was also isolated. His position meant relationships were strategic rather than genuine. People approached him seeking favor or avoiding his displeasure, not because they wanted authentic connection. Megan Wright was hired as household staff at the family's Shanghai compound when Du Hyun was in the middle of this succession preparation. She was British, 26 years old, working abroad to save money for graduate school. She'd been hired through an agency that placed international domestic workers with wealthy families. The agency hadn't disclosed that the Sung family's wealth came from organized crime. Megan had thought she was working for successful business executives, not for a criminal dynasty. She discovered the truth gradually through overheard conversations and observed activities that made the family's actual business clear. By the time she understood, she'd been working there 6 months and needed the income enough to rationalize staying despite the problematic employer. Du Hyun had noticed her because she was different from other household staff. She wasn't intimidated by the family's power. She didn't treat him with the deference and fear that everyone else showed. She was professional but not submissive, efficient but not servile. He'd started seeking her out for conversation during rare moments when he wasn't managing operations. She was intelligent, well-educated despite working as domestic staff, interesting to talk to about topics beyond criminal business. Over several months, those conversations had developed into genuine connection that surprised them both. Du Hyun wasn't supposed to form attachments to household staff. Megan wasn't supposed to develop feelings for her employer, especially when that employer was crime boss. But the connection existed regardless of whether it was appropriate. The relationship had become physical after 10 months of Megan's employment. They'd been careful, discreet, both aware that the relationship violated multiple unspoken rules about class boundaries and operational security. For 3 months, they'd maintained the affair while pretending publicly that Megan was just household staff and Du Hyun was just the heir to the family business. Then Megan had discovered she was pregnant. She'd told Du Hyun immediately, expecting, she didn't know what. Support? Acknowledgement? Some indication that their relationship meant enough to him to address the pregnancy as shared responsibility? What she'd gotten was cold calculation about damage control. You need to terminate the pregnancy, Du Hyun had said. We'll provide funds for the procedure and for your discretion about the relationship. You'll leave the household staff position and we'll arrange alternative employment elsewhere. You want me to terminate the pregnancy and leave? That's your response? That's the practical response. A child complicates succession planning, creates vulnerabilities my family can't accept, and binds us to each other in ways that aren't sustainable given our respective positions. I'm not terminating the pregnancy because it's inconvenient for your succession planning. Then you're making a choice that excludes continued relationship with me. I can't acknowledge a child born to household staff. My family won't accept that relationship. You'll be on your own. So I either terminate the pregnancy or you abandon us? Those are the options. I'm sorry they're not what you wanted, but they're reality given who I am and what position I'm inheriting. Megan had been devastated but also furious at the callous calculation. I'm keeping the baby. And I'm leaving. You don't have to worry about me complicating your succession. I want nothing to do with your family or your criminal empire. She'd planned to resign from her position, take her savings, and return to the UK where she'd figure out how to raise a child as a single mother. But Du Hyun's family had discovered the relationship and the pregnancy before she could leave on her own terms. Du Hyun's mother, the current matriarch of the family, had confronted Megan with cold fury about the inappropriate relationship and the pregnancy that threatened to create complications. "You seduced my son. Used your position in this household to create relationship that violates every boundary of appropriate behavior. Now you're pregnant and expecting what? Marriage? Acknowledgement? Financial support? I'm not expecting anything. I was planning to leave. You were planning to leverage the pregnancy for continued financial benefit. That's obvious manipulation. We won't tolerate it. I wasn't manipulating anyone. I was leaving to raise my child away from your family. You'll leave immediately. With compensation for your silence about the relationship and about this household's business. You'll sign agreements that you won't seek support from Du Hyun, won't claim the child as his, won't contact our family again. In exchange, you'll receive enough money to manage for several years. What if I don't sign your agreements? Then you leave with nothing and we ensure your employment prospects are severely limited anywhere you attempt to work. We have extensive reach. Making your life difficult would be trivial if you refuse to cooperate." Megan had been 8 weeks pregnant, alone in a foreign country, facing threats from a criminal organization. She'd signed the agreements, taken the offered compensation, and left Shanghai that same day. She'd returned to the UK, had her son, named Kai, and built life as single mother. The compensation from the Sung family had lasted 2 years. After that, she'd worked while managing childcare, struggled financially, raised Kai alone without any support from his father or his father's family. 7 years later, she'd built stable life. Not wealthy, not privileged, but sustainable. Kai was 5 years old, bright and strong-willed, showing personality traits that reminded her constantly of Du Hyun despite having no contact with his father. Then she'd received unexpected contact from Du Hyun's younger sister, Ji-yeon. Ji-yeon had been 16 when Megan had worked for the family, had been kind to her, had been upset when Megan had been forced to leave. Now she was 23, and she'd tracked down Megan with urgent message. "My brother is dying. He has aggressive cancer, terminal diagnosis. He has months at most. He wants to see you and to meet his son before he dies." Megan had been shocked by the news and conflicted about the request. "He kicked me out when I was pregnant. Offered money to terminate the pregnancy. Abandoned his child without ever meeting him. Why would I bring Kai to meet a father who's never acknowledged him? Because Du Hyun regrets everything about how he handled the situation. He spent 7 years wishing he'd made different choices. The diagnosis made him realize he's going to die without ever knowing his son. He wants to meet Kai. Not to claim him or to bring him into the family, just to know him before he dies. That's asking me to expose Kai to a dying stranger who happens to be his biological father. That's potentially traumatizing. It's asking you to give Du Hyun the opportunity to meet his child before he dies. What you tell Kai about who Du Hyun is would be up to you. But my brother deserves to see his son at least once." Against her better judgment, or perhaps because 7 years had softened her anger enough to allow compassion, Megan had agreed to bring Kai to Shanghai. She'd explained to Kai that they were visiting China to meet someone important from her past. She hadn't told him about Du Hyun being his father. That revelation would depend on how the meeting went. They'd arrived at the Sung family compound in Shanghai, been escorted to the massive throne room where Du Hyun conducted business. The room was designed to intimidate: marble floors, high ceilings, ornate furnishings, positioned throne-like chair where Du Hyun held court. Everyone who entered was expected to show deference, to acknowledge the power represented by the space and by the man who controlled it. Megan entered with Kai holding her hand. She saw Du Hyun for the first time in 7 years, thinner than she remembered, showing visible effects of the illness, but still carrying himself with the authority that made people cautious around him. Du Hyun looked at Kai with obvious emotion. Seeing his son for the first time, recognizing features that were unmistakably his own mixed with Megan's, processing that this child existed because of choices he'd made 7 years ago. Kai looked at Du Hyun with complete lack of fear or deference. He was 5 years old, had been raised by a mother who'd taught him that every person had equal human worth regardless of their power or status. Bow to your father, one of Du-hyun's guards said when Kai didn't immediately show deference. Kai looked at the guard, looked at Du-hyun, crossed his arms, and said clearly, I don't bow to anyone. My mom says everyone is equal and bowing suggests someone is better than me. Are you better than me? The question was directed at Du-hyun with child's directness. The throne room went completely silent. No one had ever refused to show deference to Du-hyun, certainly not a 5-year-old child in the middle of his seat of power. Du-hyun stared at this small boy who refused to acknowledge his authority, who stood in the center of massive throne room completely unshaken by power that made grown men tremble. And he felt something shift fundamentally in his understanding of what mattered and what he'd lost by abandoning this child. Subscribe to see what happens when a child's refusal to bow shatters a dying king's assumptions, when 7 years of absence must be addressed in the limited time remaining, and whether regret can transform into relationship when the person you abandoned refuses to acknowledge your power. Comment where you're watching from, and tell me, would you bow to someone just because they had power? This story is just beginning. Du-hyun looked at Kai. His son, standing defiant in the throne room, refusing to bow, questioning whether his father was better than him. The guards were waiting for Du-hyun's response. Megan was tense, clearly concerned about how Du-hyun would react to his child's defiance. Du-hyun felt overwhelming emotion that had nothing to do with authority being challenged and everything to do with recognizing that this child, his child, had been raised with values he'd never developed, top principles about human equality that directly contradicted everything about the world Du-hyun controlled. No, Du-hyun said quietly. I'm not better than you. And you don't have to bow to me. Your mother taught you well. Kai considered this answer, seemed satisfied. Good. Mom says you're dying. Is that true? The directness was startling. Megan looked mortified that Kai had blurted that out so bluntly. Kai, we discussed not asking direct questions about sensitive topics. It's fine, Du-hyun said. He deserves honest answers. Yes, I'm dying. I have cancer that can't be cured. I have months remaining, maybe less. Does it hurt? Sometimes. But doctors give me medicine that helps manage the pain. Why did you want to meet me if you're dying? Mom said you never wanted to know me before. Megan intervened. Kai, that's not exactly what I said. It's accurate, Du-hyun said. I didn't want to know you before because I made terrible choices about priorities. I thought maintaining power and avoiding complications was more important than being your father. I was wrong. Now that I'm dying, I realize I wasted 7 years not knowing my son. I asked your mother to bring you here so I could meet you before I die. Are you sorry you didn't know me before? I'm very sorry. Not knowing you is one of my biggest regrets. Will you die soon? Like this week? Probably not this week. Maybe a few months. Doctors aren't certain about timing. Kai processed this information with the pragmatism of children. Okay. Can I ask you questions while you're still alive? So I can know about my dad before he dies? Du-hyun felt tears threatening, something he hadn't experienced in decades, certainly not in his throne room in front of guards and family members. You can ask me anything. I'll answer honestly. Over the next hour, Kai asked direct questions about Du-hyun's life, his work. Megan had prepared him that Du-hyun ran complicated businesses, his family, why he'd never been part of Kai's life. Du-hyun answered everything honestly in age-appropriate terms. He explained that he ran businesses that sometimes created conflicts with other people's businesses, that his work required being very careful about family and safety, that he'd made bad choices about priorities when Kai was born. Do you wish you'd made different choices? Kai asked. More than anything. If I could change how I responded when your mother told me about you, I would. But I can't change the past. I can only try to know you now with whatever time I have remaining. That's okay. Mom says people can be forgiven if they're really sorry and if they try to be better. Are you trying to be better? I'm trying to be the father I should have been 7 years ago. I don't know if months are enough time to make up for 7 years of absence, but I'm going to try. After Kai's direct questioning, Megan and Du-hyun talked privately while Kai explored the compound under Ji-yeon's supervision. He's extraordinary, Du-hyun said. You've raised him to be confident, principled, unafraid of power. That's remarkable given the circumstances you've managed alone. I raised him to be a good person. To understand that everyone has equal worth regardless of status. To question authority rather than just accepting it. Those were important values given that his father abandoned us, and I wanted him to know his worth wasn't determined by whether you acknowledged him. You succeeded. He stood in my throne room and refused to bow because he'd been taught that bowing suggests inequality. No adult has ever done that in this space. A 5-year-old challenged my authority through principles his mother taught him. That's powerful parenting. Don't romanticize it. I raised him alone because you offered money to terminate the pregnancy and then abandoned us when I refused. The values I taught him were survival mechanism for single parenting. He needed to know his worth when his father didn't acknowledge him. I know. I'm not asking for credit for how he turned out. I'm just recognizing that you've done extraordinary work raising him. And I'm grateful you brought him here despite having every reason to refuse. I brought him because GN convinced me you deserved to meet your son before you die. But I have conditions about how this proceeds. You don't tell Kai he's heir to criminal empire. You don't involve him in your business. You don't try to claim him or bring him into your world. You can know him during whatever time you have remaining, but he goes back to the UK with me and lives his life separate from your organization. I accept those conditions. I don't want to bring him into this world. It's exactly what I was trying to avoid by pushing you away 7 years ago. I just want to know my son before I die. And after you die? What happens to us then? Whatever you choose. I'll arrange financial support for both of you, not as obligation or as attempt to buy forgiveness, just as recognition that I should have been supporting you for 7 years. Beyond that, what relationship you maintain with my family is entirely your decision. Over the next 3 months, Du-hyun spent increasing amounts of time with Kai, building relationship with the son he'd abandoned. Kai visited the compound regularly, sometimes staying overnight when Megan's work schedule required it. He asked endless questions about everything: Du-hyun's childhood, his work, his illness, why he'd made the choices he'd made about not being Kai's father initially. Du-hyun answered everything honestly. He didn't sugarcoat his profession or his past choices. He explained in age-appropriate terms that he'd run criminal businesses, that he'd made decisions that hurt people including Kai and his mother, that he regretted many of those choices now that he was dying. Why did you do bad things for your business? Kai asked during one of their conversations. Because I thought power and money were more important than being a good person. I was wrong about that priority. Are you a good person now? I'm trying to be. I can't undo the bad things I did. But I can try to make better choices with the time I have remaining. Mom says dying makes people think about what really matters. Is that true for you? Very true. I spent 40 years building power and wealth. Now that I'm dying, I realize the only things that actually matter are relationships with people I care about. I wasted 7 years not knowing you because I prioritized power over family. That was stupid and wrong. It's okay. You can know me now. And I can know you before you die. That's better than never knowing each other. The child's forgiveness and pragmatism about the situation was humbling in ways Du-hyun hadn't anticipated. 4 months after the throne room confrontation, Du-hyun's condition deteriorated significantly. The cancer was progressing faster than doctors had predicted. He had weeks remaining, maybe days. He called Megan and Kai to the compound for final conversations while he was still lucid enough to communicate clearly. I'm dying soon, he told Kai directly. Maybe this week, maybe next week. Before I die, I want to tell you some important things. Okay. I'm listening. First, I'm sorry I wasn't your father for your first 5 years. That was my fault, not your mother's, not yours. I made bad choices that hurt both of you. I can't fix that, but I want you to know I regret it. Second, you're an extraordinary child. You're kind, brave, smart, principled. Your mother raised you to be better than I ever was. I'm proud of who you are even though I don't deserve credit for it. Third, I'm leaving money for you and your mother. Not to buy forgiveness. I know money doesn't fix what I did. Just to ensure you have resources I should have been providing all along. Fourth, my family might try to claim you after I die. They might say you're the heir to the business because you're my son. You don't have to accept that. You can choose completely different life. Your mother and I agree that you should grow up in the UK, away from this world. My family's claims don't obligate you to anything. Kai processed this seriously. Will your family try to make me run the business after you die? They might try. My sister Jian will probably take over operations, but some family members might argue you should be involved because you're my son. You can refuse. You're 5 years old, no one can force you into this life. I don't want to run criminal businesses. I want to be like Mom, work at helping people, not hurting them. That's good choice. Be like your mother. She's better person than I ever was. Du-hyun died 3 days after that conversation. Peaceful death, family present, his final moments spent looking at his son and feeling grateful he'd had months to know the child he'd abandoned. The funeral was massive. Criminal organizations throughout East Asia sent representatives, politicians who'd been influenced by Sung money attended. The compound was filled with people showing deference to the dead king. Kai attended with Megan, watched the proceedings with interest but without the grief that adults showed. He'd known Du-hyun for only 4 months. The relationship had been real but not deep enough to create devastating loss. After the funeral, the family gathered to discuss succession and organizational transition. Megan and Kai were invited to attend, though Megan was reluctant. We shouldn't be part of family business discussions. Kai is going back to the UK with me. Your succession plans aren't our concern. The succession plans directly affect Kai, Jian said. Some family members are arguing he should be acknowledged as heir because he's Du-hyun's only child. I need you present to make clear that Kai isn't accepting that role. The family meeting was held in the same throne room where Kai had refused to bow 4 months earlier. Du-hyun's uncle, Song-ho, who'd been senior advisor to the family, made his position clear immediately. Kai is Du-hyun's only child. By tradition and by logic, he should be recognized as heir to the family business. He's young but he can be trained. The organization remains under family control. Kai is 5 years old, Megan said. He can't run criminal operations. And more importantly, he's not accepting any role in your organization. He's going back to the UK with me to have normal childhood away from this world. You don't make that decision. The family makes that decision. Kai is Sung family member. He belongs here, being prepared for leadership. I make decisions about my son's life. Du-hyun and I agreed that Kai would grow up in the UK, separate from this organization. His final wishes support my authority over Kai's upbringing. Du-hyun's final wishes don't override family interests. Kai is the heir. He stays in Shanghai, is raised within the family, is prepared for succession. Kai, who'd been sitting quietly, spoke up with the same directness he'd shown in his first meeting with Du-hyun. I'm not staying in Shanghai. I'm going home with my mom. I don't want to run criminal businesses. I don't want to be king like my dad was. I just want to be normal kid. Song-ho looked at the child with obvious frustration. You're 5 years old. You don't understand what you're refusing. I understand that you want me to do something I don't want to do. My mom taught me I can say no to things I don't want. I'm saying no to being king. You can't refuse family obligations. I can. I'm refusing. You can't make me do things I don't want. The same defiance that had made Kai refuse to bow was now making him refuse the succession his uncle was trying to impose. Song-ho looked ready to argue further but Jian interrupted. Kai is right. He's 5 years old, he's made his choice clear, and his mother has legal authority over his upbringing. The family can't force him into succession against his will and against his mother's authority. I'm taking over operations as we'd planned before Du-hyun's death. Kai goes to the UK and lives his life separate from our business. You're letting the heir walk away because a child says he doesn't want the responsibility? I'm respecting my brother's final wishes and this child's clearly stated preferences. He doesn't want this life. Forcing him into it serves no one. The family meeting dissolved into arguments about succession and tradition and whether Jian had authority to override Songho's position. Through it all, Kai sat calmly, arms crossed, showing the same complete lack of fear or deference that had characterized his first meeting with Du Hian. He'd refused to bow to the king. Now he was refusing to become the king. Both refusals coming from the same principle: no one had inherent authority over him just because of power or tradition. The succession arguments continued for weeks. Songho insisted Kai should be brought into the family, trained for eventual leadership. Jian maintained that Kai's wishes and Megan's authority had to be respected. Through all of it, Kai remained completely unmoved by the power struggle happening around him. "Why don't you want to be king?" Jian asked him during one of their conversations. "You could have power, wealth, people following your orders. That's attractive to most people." "I don't want people to follow my orders. I want people to be my friends because they like me, not because they're scared of me. My dad said people were scared of him." "That sounds lonely." It was lonely. But it was also powerful. He could make things happen just by deciding they should happen. "He also died without knowing me for most of my life because he thought being powerful was more important than being my dad. I don't want to make that mistake." Jian reported this conversation to Megan. "Your son is wiser than most adults I know. He understands that power comes with costs that aren't worth paying. He understands that because I've taught him that relationships matter more than status." Du Hian learned that lesson too late. "I'm making sure Kai knows it from the beginning." 6 weeks after Du Hian's death, the family reached compromise. Kai would not be brought into the organization or prepared for leadership. Jian would take over operations officially. Kai and Megan would return to the UK with financial support from the family trust Du Hian had established. But they'd maintain connection to the family, visit annually, allow Kai to know his Korean heritage, keep the relationship open if Kai ever changed his mind about involvement. "I won't change my mind," Kai said when Megan explained the arrangement. "But I can visit Aunt Jian. She's nice and she doesn't try to make me do things I don't want." They returned to the UK 3 months after arriving in Shanghai. The financial support from Du Hian's trust meant Megan could reduce her work hours, could provide better for Kai, could build the stability she'd struggled to achieve as single mother. "Do you miss your dad?" Megan asked Kai a few months after they'd returned home. "A little. I didn't know him very long but I liked talking to him. He was honest about making mistakes. That was good." "Are you angry that he wasn't part of your life before?" "Not really. He explained why he made that choice and he said he was wrong. He died before he could fix it completely but he tried. That's better than never trying. You're very forgiving for someone so young. You taught me that people make mistakes and that being mad forever doesn't help. He made a big mistake but he was sorry. Being angry about it after he's dead seems pointless." Kai's pragmatism about his father's absence and death was remarkable. He'd integrated the 4 months with Du Hian into his life story without letting it define him or creating lasting trauma about abandonment. 10 years after refusing to bow in the throne room, Kai was 15 and still showing the same independence and principled defiance that had characterized his first meeting with Du Hian. He'd maintained contact with Jian, visited Shanghai occasionally, knew about his father's world without being part of it. He'd chosen a completely different path, focused on education, interested in social justice work, planning to use the financial resources Du Hian had left him to fund projects that helped people rather than controlled them. "Do you ever regret refusing the succession?" Megan asked during one of their conversations. "You could have had enormous power and wealth if you'd accepted Songho's proposal. I have wealth from the trust fund. I don't need power. Dad died lonely because he chose power over relationships. I'm choosing relationships over power. That seems like better life. Your dad would be proud of that choice. I think he would be too. He told me to be like you instead of like him. I'm trying to do that." 15 years after being forced out of the Sung household while pregnant, Megan had raised a son who'd refused to bow to power, who'd turned down succession to criminal empire, who'd chosen principles over status because he'd been taught that human worth wasn't determined by position or wealth. Du Hian had died knowing his son for only 4 months. But those 4 months had shown him what he'd lost by choosing power over family, what his son had become through Megan's parenting, what actually mattered when facing death. The child who refused to bow had taught the dying king that authority was meaningless when the person who should fear you most simply refused to acknowledge your power. And that lesson, delivered by a 5-year-old with crossed arms and absolute certainty about his own worth, had been more valuable than any succession plan or organizational strategy Du Hyun had developed over 40 years of ruling criminal empire. True power isn't commanding obedience, it's earning respect through character rather than through force. Du Hyun-sung spent 40 years building authority that made people tremble. He commanded absolute obedience through combination of strategic ruthlessness and organizational control. Everyone who entered his presence showed deference. Until a 5-year-old walked into his throne room and refused to bow. Kai's refusal wasn't rebellion or disrespect. It was principle taught by a mother who'd been discarded by Du Hyun's family, who'd raised her son to understand that every person has equal worth regardless of status or power. That principle, that human equality means no one is inherently better than anyone else, directly contradicted everything about Du Hyun's world. In his organization, hierarchy was absolute. Power determined worth. Deference was required. But Kai didn't accept those premises. He'd been taught differently by a mother who'd survived being discarded while pregnant, who'd built stable life through determination rather than through position. The confrontation should have been trivial, crime boss correcting a child's inappropriate behavior. Instead it became revelation that authority built on fear is meaningless when someone refuses to be afraid. Their story proves that abandonment creates consequences beyond just absence. Du Hyun thought pushing Megan away would eliminate complications. Instead it meant 7 years of not knowing his son, 7 years of missing the child's development, 7 years that couldn't be recovered when terminal diagnosis made him realize what he'd lost. It also proves that principles taught through adversity are more powerful than privileges granted through wealth. Kai's understanding of human equality, his refusal to defer to power, his pragmatic forgiveness of his father's mistakes, all of that came from Megan's parenting through difficult circumstances, not from anything Du Hyun's wealth or status provided. Most importantly, their story demonstrates that dying clarifies what actually matters. Du Hyun spent 40 years building power. Facing death, he realized the only thing that mattered was relationship with the son he'd abandoned, the child who'd been taught principles that contradicted everything Du Hyun had built his life on. Those 4 months of knowing Kai, of being challenged by a child who refused to acknowledge his authority, who questioned his choices, who forgave his mistakes while maintaining clear boundaries about not accepting succession, taught Du Hyun more about value and meaning than 40 years of criminal leadership. The woman they kicked out while pregnant became the mother who raised a son strong enough to refuse a king's succession. The child who refused to bow became the person who taught a dying king that authority is meaningless without earned respect. Both of them proving that true power isn't commanding obedience. It's living according to principles that make obedience unnecessary because respect is freely given rather than forced through fear. If you love this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about children's defiance teaching powerful lessons, abandoned sons returning to refuse succession, and authority crumbling when someone simply refuses to acknowledge your power. Comment below, would you bow to someone just because they had power? Or do you believe everyone has equal worth regardless of status? Share your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most powerful challenge to authority isn't rebellion, it's simple refusal to acknowledge that power makes someone better than you. Stand in the center of the throne room with arms crossed and refuse to bow. That defiance teaches more than any violence ever could about what real power means. Until next time.